So, so I'm
Okay.
delighted to be here today talking to you, Tim, and just a little bit about my background. So I trained originally as a clinical psychologist, and then I was invited on a long overland traverse of Antarctica. And so my PhD is essentially on work stress in Antarctica, so really an organizational psych. And then I got into management consulting in Canada and in New Zealand. And I did that for some years, and then I got a bit bored, and I found myself a job in Hong Kong and moved to Hong Kong. Did coaching and consulting there for 8 years. Came back in 2000 and started the Executive Coaching Centre here in Auckland. So that's really the background. So now I'm just a full-time coach. I don't do anything else. I've basically let go all of my management consulting work. So I just do coaching and I write. And as you can see, including schema coaching.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's great to have the time to talk to you, Ian.
Thank you,
Obviously,
Tim.
I've kind of forged a bit of a relationship with you over the last 18 months, which has been awesome for me. I've learnt so much. The one thing we have in common is the love and passion of schema. My background is I'm a schema therapist primarily, but I've moved into the coaching space. Awesome. So as well, which has been awesome. So I rushed down to the post office today and picked up my copy of Schema
Yay!
Coaching. Didn't get signed, but we'll talk about that offline about that. So the value of it's not what it was. But what I'm really excited to talk to you about, Ian, is the book in more detail. And
Yes.
I've had the luxury of reading parts of it. You've sent me a few bits and pieces. Um, so I've been able to sort of get across a fair bit of it. And we've done some work together, which has been really cool. So I thought maybe we kick this off to, anyone who's not all that well kind of versed in schema land. What is schema coaching?
Okay, so schema coaching is really an approach, an integrated approach for coaches to use with people who have deep-seated challenges.
Mm.
Its background is that, as you rightly said, Tim, it comes from schema therapy, so it really uses many of the same kinds of techniques and approaches, but of course it's being used in a very different kind of population. So it's not being used in the clinical population, it's being used in the coaching population. And what do I mean by that? Well, generally, people in the coaching population have a considerable degree of psychological stability, social stability, and vocational stability. So, in other words, they don't tend to suffer from addictions or psychiatric illness or any of those kind of things. They tend to be in relationships of one sort or another,
Yeah.
and they tend to be able to hold down a job. Now,
Yeah.
people in the clinical population are obviously enormously varied, but very often they are challenged on at least one or two of those. So we're dealing with primarily with people in the workplace, and in my own work, I'm dealing with executives, so more senior leaders.
Yeah, that's a good distinction to make, isn't it, as a schema therapist, which we'll get into more about the differences. But there's a lot more schemas you see versus what you see in the workplace where there's a
Yes,
higher level of functioning. So
yes.
yeah, that's a good explanation, good distinction. So schema, I believe it's a Greek word meaning shape from what I
Yes.
know. What are schema and where do they come from?
Okay, that's a great question, Tim. So, all children, as they grow, have certain very fundamental needs. Now, some of those needs are obviously physical needs, but then there are needs that are psychological, and those are primarily for closeness and love and care and a sense of connection and an ability to uh, have their own emotions and feelings validated, to be recognized for their achievements. So there's a whole range of things that happen, which, and if all of those are basically ticked off, the person is a high functioning individual. However, for most of us, certainly me, and I know for you as well, Tim, there are certain areas where we, as we grew up, we weren't able to have some of our needs fulfilled. And that's no one's fault. That's just how it is. Partly a product of our society, partly a product of the necessities of life, and partly a product of the kind of culture that we live in. So individuals end up very often with some kind of area of unmet need in their life. And those unmet needs are typically called early maladaptive schemas. So they are the areas where the person believes that fundamentally, despite everything they do, they're a failure, or they whatever they do is not good enough, or a whole lot of those kinds of things. But schemas are also positive. So for those areas where we did have our needs met as a child, we can go on. And so there are positive schemas, for example, like success, like
Yep.
emotional connection, the ability to maintain relationships and so on. So it's really a classification system of developmental of attachment issues. So it comes out of attachment Bowlby and that
Yep.
kind of work. So it comes out of attachment. So it's really a classification of attachments. But the thing that makes it different is that this is not something that the therapist or the coach imposes like a diagnosis on the client. This is something that the coach and the client work collaboratively together to talk through, to think about, and to jointly identify. So I've developed a very small, simple approach to assessing coach schemas in the coaching environment. And basically, it just says, here's a whole lot of things. Does this sound like you? And
Yep.
so this isn't a kind of a top-down process. This is a collaborative process of, wow, yes, that sounds a bit like me. So
Yeah.
that's essentially the nature of schema, positive and negative.
Yeah, and this is all in the book as well, which is really good the way it's explained, which I want to talk a bit more about in a sec, actually. But that's a good explanation. I think the overriding theme for me is that no one's immune from schemas. We've all got them. Doesn't matter if you're, in the mailroom or the CEO.
Yeah,
Everyone's got schemas because we all
yeah,
come from somewhere and we've all got a personality, so no one's immune from them.
yeah,
So, it really
yeah.
is.
Exactly, Tim. I think attachment is a fundamental part of
Yes.
being human.
Yep.
So if the attachment is good or bad, that's what leads to these fundamental beliefs we call schema. So absolutely right.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Mm.
Um, Schema modes, because that gets talked about a lot, but I wonder if you could maybe talk a bit about, what you read the book, you're going to read a lot about schema modes. What's a schema mode? What's the definition of that?
So to understand schema modes, we need to really just go back a little bit to Jeffrey Young, who developed schema therapy.
Yeah.
So Jeffrey Young was, so this was in the early 2000s. He was a Gestalt therapist, and he worked a lot with people with anxiety and depression. And generally, he found that the Gestalt approach worked well with those people.
Mm.
However, he then started working with people with personality disorders. So these are primarily disorders of emotional regulation. So these are
Mm.
people who very often flip rapidly between emotions, and who have a lot of trouble in self-regulation. And when he worked with those people, what he found was that his Gestalt therapy tools didn't work so well at all. And
Mm.
these people were very difficult to deal with. So he could identify schema, he could identify the underlying maladaptive and positive patterns that these
Yep.
people have. But when he got them in the therapy room, what he found is they flipped rapidly between essentially mood
Right.
states. So they would come in and maybe they'd be feeling miserable and horrible about something that happened, and then they'd switch very rapidly to become very angry, and
Mm.
then they would switch to become very manipulative. So these kind of rapid
Mm.
changes. And so he decided that schemas were great to identify essentially, if we look at it in terms of personality theory, the traits, um,
Yes.
and modes are essentially the mood states. So they're the things that
Yes.
fluctuate. So what we do in schema coaching is we primarily try and understand the client through the lens of the schema. So what are the fundamental things that you believe? But we also are aware of the fact that, and particularly if we see it in the coaching office, is that very often the schemas will lead us to a situation where the client is moving between mood states or getting caught up in a mood state where they can't get out. So it's kind of a state trait kind of distinction that's made.
Yeah, that's how my schema learning has always been that schemas are traits, modes are states. So, and
Yes.
I like to liken it to you can't see the schema because they're an emotion type of thing and they're
Yep.
so at a fundamental base level. But what we can see is how they're acting out, how they're behaving.
Yes.
Um, you've got a bit of a take on seeing more modes than others in the workplace, haven't you?
Yes, yes. So essentially, there is a big difference between clients who are clinical clients and
Mm,
clients who we see in coaching.
mm,
And one of the characteristics, of course, if we take that definition of the coaching client who's psychologically, socially, and vocationally more stable, is there's a whole lot of both schemas and modes that we don't frequently see. So, for
mm,
example, it's very common for clients who are in therapy to have been abandoned. Mother or father becomes depressed, or one's an alcoholic, or one leaves, walks away. So there's a lot of abandonment and very often quite a lot of abuse type schemas that we see a lot in therapy, which for obvious reasons we don't see in coaching because people who are very disturbed can't get their act together unless they have a lot of therapy to the point where they can essentially climb up the organizational ladder. So we see a much smaller, simpler set of schemas in coaching, and the same goes for
yes,
modes. So,
yes.
for example, in therapy, we might see bully attack, which is
Mm,
obviously what it means.
yep.
We don't very often see that in coaching.
Yeah.
Occasionally, but of course, coaching is voluntary and it's highly participatory. So if you're basically a bully, you don't need coaching, they do.
Yes. Yes.
So we don't tend to see those kinds of people.
Yes. Of course. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, and yeah, sort of in my clinical work, I probably see the whole gamut or cross section of the other ones like avoidance altogether
Yes.
and bully attack, commonly known as overcompensation and things
Yeah.
like that. So it makes
Yeah.
sense that the surrendering style is more prevalent in the workplace.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
This thing called it's in the book, Schema Octagon. What's the Schema Octagon?
Yes. So one of the things, so Schema is fantastic because it really offers a great deal of in the package, as it were.
Mm,
And one of the fundamental ideas that I really liked doing Russ Harris's acceptance and commitment therapy course was his ACT hexagon. So it's basically just a hexagon around which he's able to identify the various elements. And I really like that idea. And of course, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. So I decided that we could usefully have a hexagon which illustrated all of the different elements that at least I believe are important in the coaching environment, which are really a subset of what you see in the therapy environment. And at the very heart of the schema octagon is what we call limited reparenting. And that's a really fundamental
mm,
kind of idea that we can maybe just explore for a minute, because it's really the idea that the the relationship between coach and client is incredibly important in all coaching. But in schema coaching, we try to go one step further. So our aim isn't just to have a highly functioning, empathetic, warm, caring kind of environment. We recognize in schema that this person has some early maladaptive schema. So we are trying to do more than just to help them to be able to identify unfortunate thinking patterns or
Mm.
whatever it is. What we're
Yes.
really trying to do is to heal those ancient scars. We're here to be a parent to the person, but in a limited kind of way, because obviously that's the nature of coaching. So limited reparenting is at the heart of the Schema Octagon. And then around the outside of the octagon, we've got elements like schema conceptualization, which means um, how can the coach and the client work together to identify the schema? We've
Yep.
got psychoeducation and so on and so on. So we've got a whole series of different elements, all of which are integrated around the idea that once we have identified some positive and negative schema for the with the client, then we've got a whole toolkit that we can use. So this isn't just a haphazard collection of things. This is an integrated set of tools because the tools are all directed towards the same kind of underlying schema issues. So, for example, we might use a psychodynamic approach to deal with schemas, and then we might use a cognitive behavior therapy, and then we might use
Yes.
emotional exposure, and so on and so on. So, we've got in the schema toolkit a whole series of things that we can use. And I think that's one of the reasons why schema has become so incredibly popular. Well, there's probably two reasons. One is
Mm.
nearly all of us can identify with some of the schema. So, it's not
Yep.
diagnosis, it's identification.
That's right.
And secondly, it's not just a one modality approach. There's lots and lots and lots in this, and you really come away from training in this area with a very large number of things that you can use with the client.
Yeah, and what I really love, and this is probably schema again in general, is the uh and the octagon and what it brings. It's a roadmap. You know what I mean?
Yes,
I think it's all
yes,
good to sort of identify what a person's schemas are. And this is the issue. But it's now what? Well, this is so
yeah,
great because it's a
yeah,
roadmap to getting it right or
yeah.
improving an area that needs improvement.
Yeah, and
And
I
the
really like that description, Tim, because the thing about the octagon, of course, is that you don't start from one and go to eight.
yeah,
Like a road map, there's four routes to this, and you might
yeah.
just go to that place and this place. So you can kind of mix and match and do whatever really meets the needs of the client rather than having some kind of fixed protocol.
Yeah, and something else, and I was going to bring this up a little bit later, but since we're there, I'm going to touch on it now. What I really like about the book and the content of the book and the model is that, there's two aspects to it. It's centered at the clinically trained and the non-clinically trained. So
Yes,
for someone starting out with schema coaching, complement into their existing coaching, there's elements that they can absolutely lean on here. They don't need to be a dyed in the wool, rusted on student of schema.
yes,
There's things that they can absolutely use here in
yes.
in the octagon, which is I
Yeah.
think is a really important point.
Yeah, yeah. No, thanks, Tim. That is a really good issue. So, what happened when I started originally publishing in this area in journals like The Coaching Psychologist is I got some really interesting feedback about the articles that I was writing, and there was a lot of concern about, well, you're opening Pandora's box,
Mm.
and there are a lot of coaches out there who have a very broad range of different skills and experience. And I just think there was the comment, we just need to be careful about
Yes. Just
recommending who should do what.
small
So
everything.
essentially, the book is in two parts. So a
Yeah.
whole lot of techniques for people who are ICFE, MCC, etc. trained, but who aren't a, excuse me, a clinical psychologist, counselor, psychotherapist, and then a whole lot of other techniques which are really for people who are clinically trained or for other people who've had quite a lot of therapy themselves, particularly people who are willing to find a therapist, do some work themselves,
Mm.
and work with the therapist on the technique they want to learn. So they're really learning in a kind of an experiential way. And of course, with obviously adequate supervision and adherence to ethical coaching and staying within their boundaries of competence and so on. But uh, that's why the book is like this, because it is such a neat field. You wouldn't want to say, well, this is only for clinically trained, psychotherapeutically trained coaches.
Yep.
There's an awful lot that anybody can usefully do. But on the other hand, you want some kind of warning, you want some kind of clear demarcation.
Yeah, and just to round that out, chapter 5 is on foundation techniques. So
Yes.
great. Yeah, that's been included there. So it's such an obvious go-to, which is awesome. It's
Yeah.
awesome. I was
Yeah.
really
And just to drill into that a little bit, so I think that the techniques like mindfulness release of schema pain and so
Yep.
on. Techniques like using schema challenge cards, which are a form of cognitive behavior therapy, those can
Mm.
probably be done by any trained, ethically adherent, kind of competent coach. Where there are other things like imagery rescripting, which are much more challenging to do, and where the you need to enter into it with a good degree of confidence and with an ability to deal with the unexpected, because you're entering into an area where you don't really know what's going to happen.
I'm thinking future video workshop on one of these elements would be awesome
Exactly.
of the challenge
That
card.
would be great. Yep, that would be
Let's
great.
go. All right. So we've talked about what it is, what schemas are, what modes are, what the octagon is about. Let's talk about suitability. Who are we
Right.
targeting for this
Yeah.
type of coaching?
Yeah, so that's a really important issue. So my view on this is that schema coaching should almost never be the initial approach that a coach takes.
Yes.
So there are things like, the grow model and solution focused
Yep.
coaching and all sorts of other things which are entirely appropriate for our
Mm,
high functioning clients.
mm.
So we should always start with those kinds of things, because with something like solution focused coaching, you can often get a long way in 3 or 4 sessions,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
you don't
Absolutely.
need to go any deeper than that.
Yes. You and I have had a discussion about this. I think I'll fall on my sword here. And we talked about how, the idea of just using schema coaching, is a dangerous, not a dangerous one, but there's, like, and I wrote this down as well. This book, like this model, really complements existing and, let's say, traditional coaching approaches, which is really great. And I read the solution focus one is in there, and you mentioned some other ones, and I think that's so important that's
Yes,
it complements it so well. Um,
yes,
because I've been
yeah,
caught out like that, and when I
yeah,
went back and included those things that I'd forgotten to,
yes.
totally it totally brought it to life, which was great.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes, yes. And occasionally you do find people who will come to coaching and say, look, I've been to a life coach and
Mm.
we set some goals and they followed up to see what I was doing. And that was kind of useful at the time, but actually that hasn't really touched the surface of the issues that I've got.
Yes.
I'm really looking for something much deeper, that's going to help me at a far more fundamental level. And so sometimes, though, for those people, but those are relatively rare, I would say in the last, 100 clients I've had, I'd say probably 2 or 3 of them have come with that kind of agenda. So,
Yes.
and of course, I do get some people who come to me saying, well, what is the schema coaching and da da da.
Yep.
But even with those people, I would, obviously it's the client's choice. They can do what they want, but I would always suggest that, well, why don't we just start and see how much
Yes.
progress we can make with something that's simpler and faster and cheaper and easier
Yep.
before we embark upon something that's rather more
Yeah.
challenging.
So true. So true. And it's in the title, and deep seated. So just going
Yes.
back a peg, because I kind of hijacked your question. Um, what types of clients are suitable for schema coaching when it comes to deep seated?
Yeah, yeah. So that's a great question, Tim. So the thing that we see in many executives, but also lots of people in the workplace, one of the things that we see a great deal of is this idea that um, striving must be endless, achieving must be endless. Every year we must put up the benchmark in terms of what we're expecting. Every year we must get better and better and better, to the point where this becomes a kind of a real unhealthy
Mm,
dissatisfaction with
mm,
almost anything and everyone. So occasionally you'll have a client who might come to you who said, well, look, I've had a really successful career for the last 20 years and I've done really well and I'm now in a senior position, but now I'm getting this feedback from my team that I'm too demanding, that nothing is good enough. My boss is also giving me that feedback, and horrors of horrors, I had it from a couple of my clients this
mm.
year. And my wife said to me the other day, I think what you're doing to the children is terrible. And so the person kind of gets this idea that what's
Yes.
been enormously helpful for them is now starting to become a real problem. So who is it
Yes.
suitable for? It's suitable for anyone that has that kind of issue
Yeah.
where, despite the fact that they've tried all sorts of things, they can't get out of it. And they can't get
Mm,
out of it because probably a lot of their behavior and a lot of their beliefs are still unconscious. So
yeah.
they're highly influenced by these beliefs, but they're not really aware of what those beliefs are. And over time, they have come to rationalize. So, for example, they might be in a position where they kind of feel like the profession they are in has gone soft.
Yeah.
And doesn't have the right level of standards. They might feel that young people today don't work hard enough. And, when
Yep.
I come into the car park at 7 o'clock in the morning, I'm the first in the car park. That's
Yes.
ridiculous, when I would.
Yeah.
So you see this kind of dissatisfaction with everything and everyone. And that's a kind of a classic example of what's meant by a deep-seated challenge. You're not going to get through
Yeah.
that kind of thing very easily at all. You need something
Yep.
that's far more powerful than solution-focused coaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's probably an element of, well, it's got me to 20 years to where
Yeah,
I'm at. So what's the
yeah,
problem? Why
yeah,
stop doing it? But
yeah,
it leads the questions to when is the time to kind of go, well, hang on. And you've kind of talked about, all right, well, this is now spilling into my personal life, or
yeah,
this is now encroaching on my team and
yeah,
others. And that's when we kind of go, there's that word maladaptive. This isn't
yeah.
working anymore.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right, Tim. And it happens in all sorts of ways. So it can happen to people who've got a kind of a sense of failure,
Yeah.
where that sense of failure kind of spurs them on and makes them careful and so on. But then they move up the tree and their job and their work and their people become more and more demanding, and
Mm,
therefore the risks start to rise. So there's all sorts of things that happen as you progress through your career and as your work often gets more and more demanding, that really starts to shine a light on some of these kind of Achilles heels, some of these things. So these people are often, slightly unkind phrase, but kind of brilliant but flawed.
yes. Yeah, absolutely. That's a good way of putting it in. It is perfect way actually. So, and in my kind of ventures down the coaching path in the workplace, again, very different to the therapy room. Words like imposter syndrome get thrown around. Fear of failure is a massive one.
Yes.
You know, approval seeking. They're
Yes.
the kind of themes. And I know
Yes.
we're going to talk about a bit more in depth, a bit of a case study to bring it to life in a sec. But so who should kind of use schema coaching sort of on the back of that?
Yeah. In terms of which sorts of coaches or,
Yeah, I think
yeah.
I think that's yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so I think schema coaching is ideally placed for a coach, for an experienced coach who is finding that because of their success in the solution focused cognitive behavior therapy kind of area, that they are starting to get to the point where they're getting more and more difficult clients.
Yeah.
So, what I found, this is really how I got
Yeah.
into schema in the first place. I really started to get more clients. So, I was doing a lot of acceptance and commitment type coaching, but I really
Okay.
felt like I was now getting a caliber of person where that
Mm.
kind of thing wasn't enough. And so I
Yeah.
went searching around, and so I found, stumbled upon a schema, and it kind of grew from there. So it's really for people who are experienced. It's
Yeah.
definitely not a kind of a year one, two, three kind of part of the curriculum. It's
Yeah.
definitely, 5 to 10 years of coaching kind of stuff.
Mm.
And it's for people who are finding very challenging clients who
Mm.
they are now maybe referring on,
Yeah.
or who they identify at some point and then stop working with them. So it's really for those kinds of people.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So let's talk about a case study. I don't know if you've
Mm.
got something in mind, but
Yes.
I think the beauty of this it's really going to highlight the schemas, the modes, and certainly how the coach approaches, and
Yes.
all in the book. So,
Yes, yes. So
so
let me give you a case study of this unrelenting striving that we're talking about. So we see a lot of this in professional service firms, and this particular client,
so the
uh,
schema is unrelenting striving.
yeah, unrelenting
Yep.
striving. Nothing's
Yep.
good enough.
Yep.
I have to work harder every day. I have to achieve more every year, and I'm
Yep.
constantly dissatisfied with everybody around me because they don't do that. So that kind of thing. So this guy was a very senior engineer and very successful. Had many years of really great achievements, and had done fantastically well in solving really complex problems.
Mm.
So, not quite a good people person, but really with a very impressive kind of analytic brain.
Mm.
But they came to me really because of this dissatisfaction with their own life and the feedback from others that other people didn't really want to work with them. And when that was just the team, it was one thing. When it got to, well, we've actually had a client who wants to change the design engineer, then we're
Mm.
dealing with a much bigger kind of
Okay.
problem.
Yeah. Okay.
So it really got to that kind of stage. And of course, the firm's view of this person is, look, this guy's a star. We really need to keep
Yes.
this person. This person's kind of 98% brilliant. We
Yep.
just want to do something with the other. So
Okay.
essentially, what we did was we tried some solution focused coaching for a while, but it was very clear that it wouldn't work. And
Yes.
then what I did was, and this is part of schema conceptualization, I asked that in a 2 hour session, I asked the person just to tell me the story of their life. And
Yes.
they had a very interesting story of a very withdrawn, distant kind of father who basically wasn't there for much of his early life,
Mm.
and a mother who was very anxious and depressed.
Yeah.
And so he, who was the oldest, kind of had to step into doing all sorts of things to support his parents. So it's
Okay.
almost like the parent-child relationship
Yes.
became
Yes.
inverted. And of course, he was focused on doing all sorts of things. So the particular, I asked him for a core childhood memory, and he said, well, I remember when I was about 11 or 12, my mother was feeling miserable because the hedge was all overgrown and horrible, and I decided I would go and cut the hedge. So he had a pair of hand hedge clippers, and he went out and he did about a tenth of it, and just became utterly exhausted and utterly dejected.
Oh,
And of course, his mother, despite her love for him and despite her wanting to care, was
yes.
really unable to care for him. So
Mm,
he kind of what he learned, you can see that he could have easily developed a sense of failure. He could have felt abandoned. He could have felt angry. He could have, but in his case, what he did was he ended up feeling like nothing is good enough. Whatever I do, I have to do more of it. And look
yes.
what I've got. And so that really started the whole work. So we worked on imagery rescripting, and just to give you a very
Yeah,
quick
please. Yeah.
background on that, the idea is that, and this is really for clinically trained people or
Yep.
people who've had some of this therapy themselves. The idea really is to identify a core childhood memory, ask the person to talk about it in
Mm,
detail, and then ask them to close their eyes and go through it in the first person present.
mhm.
So I am now a 12-year-old boy and I'm standing in front of this area of hedge that's it's 1 meter by 4 meters, and I can see that I've made a real mess of it, and I can see that there's 20 meters of this to go, and I just feel terrible, and I go and talk to my mum and she bursts into tears. And so essentially, when the person is telling this story in the first person, the coach comes in and says, "Can I talk to your mum?"
Okay.
And then the therapist might say, "Hey, look, Betty, I really understand that life is tough. I really understand that
Mm,
you feel totally miserable, but under these circumstances, Johnny is just feeling terrible and he
mm,
really needs some care and a hug and so on and et cetera, et cetera. And then, can I talk to you, Johnny? Hey, look,
mm.
you're a great kid. You did incredibly well, and no other buddy kid of your age could do this. And
Nice.
actually, can I help you with the hedge? Because actually, I've got an electric hedge clipper, and maybe what I'll go and do is I'll go and cut the hedge and you can pick up the pieces. How's that? So we
Nice.
kind of go in with this, and we get the sense of limited reparenting. We go in,
Yes.
we talk to the various people, we help the client. And of course, we have to be very careful here because we have to check out that offering to cut the hedge seems realistic to them or whatever. Maybe it's not, so you wouldn't want to use that. So you've got to get to know the client really well and what sort of thing that you might
Of
do.
course.
So it's a sense of entering into the imagery and changing the nature of the imagery, because under those circumstances, the client ended up feeling like nothing I do is good enough.
Mm,
So I'm now directly coming in and saying, what you did was fantastic. That's all anybody could expect from your age. And
yeah.
that's an enormously powerful message.
Yeah.
And I've got a paper that I can send anybody that's interested where I followed up with 10 clients after imagery rescripting. And it's a qualitative paper. So I did a semi-structured interview with them on, well, what is this approach? Why did we use it? What happened?
Mm,
What were the outcomes? And you can kind of read in the client's own words what they thought about it. And nearly everybody said, this is exhausting. This is really challenging, but wow, it is
yes.
amazing. So it is a very powerful technique, but you have to get it right.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely. But what a I use the word corrective experience, and what a wonderful corrective
Yeah,
experience
yeah,
is,
yeah, yeah.
because for
So that's
someone like
work.
that is
Yeah,
where's the ceiling ever been? Who knows? They don't
yeah.
know. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
exactly, exactly. So
okay.
that's working on a schema level, but also we worked later on a mode level. So what we
Yeah.
found was that he would become a bit grumpy with his team in meetings,
Okay.
and what he does, and he was at his worst sending emails.
Okay.
And I had also coached his boss. So I worked with the two of them, and we agreed that the client would CC his boss in on a whole lot of the relevant emails that he sent to his team. And the boss would be a kind of an arbitrator,
Mm.
and the boss would write back to him a little one-liner, hashtag never good enough, or hashtag these people are terrible, or
Okay.
the younger generation exclamation mark, or some little cryptic thing
Right.
that this client could see, oh yes, I've done it again. So
Okay. I
really
like
was
it.
in a very supportive professional
Yes.
environment. And we use that as a basis to help not just deal with these underlying deep-seated issues, but
Yes.
with the day-to-day kind of way he interacted with his team. So I hope that kind of illustrates the enormous breadth and depth of what
Mm.
schema coaching has to offer, and why, in many ways, it's quite different to an awful lot of what else is going on in the coaching space.
Yeah, I like it. There's a real kind of almost a quirkiness to it, but it's a constant, and it really, it's always there, and
Yeah,
always kind of being reinforced, even in
yeah,
the most subtle and gentlest of kind of ways.
yeah.
What would we be hoping? I mean, it seems like it's an obvious question, hoping to see as the end game or outcome with a fellow like that.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So what we were the I so this guy was ambitious. So
Mm.
his goal was, I want to go further in the company. I don't
Okay.
want to be stuck here. If I get stuck here, I will feel thoroughly miserable.
Mm.
I need to feel like I've got over this. I'm really starting to be able to understand myself, understand other people, be a bit more willing to listen, be a bit more willing to accept mistakes, etc., etc. So for this particular client, promotion was the criteria, and I'm delighted to say that a couple of years later, I saw him on LinkedIn, and sure enough, he'd got a serious promotion. And so it was fantastic just to really be able to see that this thing that was such an Achilles heel for him at the earlier stage had largely dissolved.
Yes, yeah, yeah, that's enormous. It's such an enormous
Yeah,
and important kind of intervention, if you want to call it that, or
yeah,
type of coaching to receive.
yeah, yeah,
A long lasting change. That's what I like about
yeah.
it, which is
And
awesome.
you can see the value of
Hmm.
having an integrated approach. So we've got one schema, so we've agreed upon that, but we're going to be able to address it in lots of different kind of ways.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything more that you wanted to point out that I haven't kind of asked you about your wonderful new book?
What I would say is that I appear, as far as I can see, to be one of the early writers in this field. And you'll see in the book that I make all sorts of rash assumptions about these are the schemas that we see in coaching, and they're different, etc. So I make a whole lot of, well, these are the techniques that I think. And over time, what I'd really like to do is to have more of a dialogue and involve other people in some of the research I'm
Yeah.
doing. For example, as I say, I've got this very simple little questionnaire. It's certainly not a psychological test, a little, very simple little questionnaire that helps the coach and the client work on schemas. So I'd really be encourage people to contact, because I didn't put it in the book, and so contact me. And I didn't put it in the book because it's really not in its final form. Contact me, get a copy, and share your anonymous data with me, because
Oh,
I
good.
make the assumption that this unrelenting striving is the number one thing we see in the workplace, but I
Mm.
don't have any evidence other than my own 10 years of working in this kind of space. So,
Yes.
it's a very early stage, and I hope that there's lots of things that I'm proved wrong about in the next decade, because it's a dynamic thing where people are collecting data, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah, that's a
I
great
think
point.
the other thing that I just say is that there has been a lot of interest in this, and
Mm.
so I have started a certificate in Schema Coaching, 12 months program, 75 hours, mixture of contact hours with me and with and coaching and reading. and small group format, so maximum 4 or 5 people in the group, so you really get to understand the stuff in detail. If you want to, you can do some schema coaching yourself in front of your peers if we can be sure that everything is psychologically safe and confidential. So if you want to do that, that's a kind of an option. In that sort of way, I hope that schema coaching can become much more widespread and that many of the people who go through the certificate can go on themselves and teach schema coaching.
Yes, and I will be the first to put my hand up and say I'm a proud student of the Schema Coaching certificate, and I absolutely love it. I look forward to it each month, and I've done
Fantastic.
so much schema training, and it's up there with the best. So, and I'm getting so much out
Fantastic.
of it.
Fantastic.
So
Fantastic. Thank you
I've
so, so
embarrassed you
much.
before and called you the godfather of schema. So people should get on board and buy the book and all the rest of it. LinkedIn, internet, how
Yeah,
can
so
that?
Iain McCormick, so it's the Scottish spelling IAINMCCORMICK.net is my website. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can, if you just simply do an internet search on schema coaching, I'm right up there. So if you're a coaching psychologist, then there's a lot of my papers in both the journal called the Coaching Psychologist or the International Journal of Evidence-Based Coaching and Mentoring or Coaching Psychology International. So there's a number of, and all of those articles are downloadable from my website. The publisher of the book is Routledge, so you can buy the book through them.
My the summer reading.
Snap.
There you go. So we've all drunk the Kool-Aid. Well, thank you, Ian. I won't take up any more of your time, but I appreciate the opportunity to ask you a bit more in-depthly about it.
Thank you, Tim. Look, I've really, really enjoyed it, and it's just a delight to both talk to you today and to have been involved with you over the last few months.
Yes.
And I'm sure we're going to become even closer, and we're going to be good friends for life. So,
Awesome. Yeah. I'm
yeah.
loving it too. It's great. Really great journey. All right. Thanks, Ian.
Okay. Thank you.